After I had completed a large portion of this video, it occurred to me that with a little effort I could make its handling of the Windows Event Viewer and SQL Server Log Viewer a bit more complete and clear. And so I've gone back and inserted some material in there. As a result, the video lacks a little bit of continuity, and that I may refer to things where you'll say, well, didn't he just refer to that? Why is he talking about it like he never talked about it before? And that can be confusing, but I'm hoping that by giving you this notice that confusion will go away. This is not intended to be a complete discussion of SQL Server or Windows security, or even account names and security associated with them. I will be discussing that further in another video. In this video, I'm hoping to show that having secure passwords is not enough, that you should also have secure account names for Windows and SQL Server so that these names are not easily guessed. You know you have a Windows account name administrator, a SQL Server account name, username, login name, SA, and there are even things we can do about that. We can change the Windows administrator account name, for example, but some of those issues are going to be handled elsewhere. I want you to start thinking about having a naming scheme for users that permits you to have their real names associated with it, but to also include a pattern or anti-pattern of special characters that will make them hard to guess. The names may still be able to be recognized. You may have a first and last name, but in fact delimited by special characters, maybe random special characters, so that if someone sees it and they're in your business and they have some business knowing it, they can recognize it as being your account even if they couldn't guess what it was. We have some powerful tools used for this and many other purposes. They have more purposes than for this discussion, but I'm hoping this discussion can also be used as an introduction to these tools for people who don't have familiarity with them. Applications log things. The operating system log things. We have the Windows Event Viewer. Shows what has been logged by the Windows Event Service. Windows is not a single monolithic chunk of code running in a single process. There are other parts of Windows that log things, and they do not each contain their own code for writing to the Windows logs files. They connect to the Windows Event Service, and so do many other applications that write to Windows Events Log, and so do other applications that write to the Windows Event Logs. The Event Log process, the Windows Event Service, does not itself have a built-in user interface. That is a separate application, which is what we use the Windows Event Viewer. This is very similar to SQL Server. The SQL Server process does not have a built-in user interface. You might say, well, what about SQL Server Management Studio? SQL Server Management Studio is not SQL Server. It runs in a separate process. And that is the same relationship that we see here between the Windows Event Viewer and the process to which Windows and other applications connect to write to the event logs. Processes do not have rights to the files that are written to. They write to the service, and the service writes to the logs. The Windows Event Viewer is not the Windows Event Log Service. The Event Log Service, I haven't seen it separately under Task Manager that shows the different things that are running. It probably does not run exclusively in its own service. It may run, probably does run, as part of the main Windows executable code. SQL Server writes some things to the Windows Event Logs through the Windows Event Service. But it also writes its own logging information directly to SQL Server log files and the SQL Server agent log files. There isn't a layer that we see, a process that we see, or a service that we see that sits between SQL Server and SQL Server agent and their own log file. We'll look in a minute at how we get to some of these tools. I just want to go directly to administrative tools under control panel. We'll see how to get to control panel in a minute if you don't know. But under administrative tools, since I was going to show this screen anyway, I decided to highlight several things that are very important that we eventually have some knowledge of in control panel administrative tools. One of them is computer management, which is a nice grouping of things that we can access if we're running Windows Server, as you probably are on a production SQL Server. It's going to be called Server Management, very similar tool. Then we see the Event Viewer, which is the subject of this video, at least in part. After that, I just want to highlight a couple of things I will not be mentioning further in this video. Local Security Policy and Performance Monitor. Local Security Policy is going to have a big role in some future discussion of security. And Performance Monitor is, in my opinion, the single most important diagnostic tool for fixing a SQL Server that is not performing well. We talk a lot about services. There is a services tool or applet from where we can start and stop services. There are some things that should not be done through this applet pertaining to SQL Server. There are some things that it's okay to do. And it makes sense to know what the difference between those are, because people sometimes just go all nuts when you start doing something that is appropriate to do from the services applet that they think should be some other way, just out of ignorance. This is the services applet. If we clicked on services under administrative tools, we would see this. There is a Windows Event Log service. It is not the Windows Event Collector service, although it might think, well, that's the one that collects them, and then we look at it through the Event Viewer. No, that's not what it is. The Windows Event Log service is what is running to collect events from Windows and from other applications. If we double click on the Windows Event Log service properties window, we'll see that we can stop it, although I can't imagine why you would want to. And I would be surprised if there were not consequences if you did. If we click on the next tab, we see that it runs under the local service account. It's running under the same security privileges as the operating system. And this is one of the few things, perhaps the only thing that I recall seeing, where you cannot change the account that a service is running under. The primary tools we're going to discuss in this video are the Windows Event Viewer. We get to that through the control panel. We'll see how to do that in detail in a moment. And to the best of my knowledge, the only things we can see through the Windows Event Viewer are things that are written by the Windows Event Service to its logs. Now, these logs may contain information pertaining to specific applications or groups of applications by name, but these logs are still written by the Windows Event Viewer, not by applications directly to disk. In contrast, the SQL Server Log File Viewer is accessed through SQL Server Management Studio. It shows information logged in SQL Server log files plus some other things. The SQL Server agent log files, the SQL Server mail log files. And it can connect to some Windows event logs created and maintained by the Windows Event Log Service. Many activities are logged both through the Windows Event Log Service and log files that an application can write directly to disk. And we're going to see that many of these events come from SQL Server. Not everything that SQL Server writes is necessarily written to both logs. Tools that assist us in using the user interfaces for these logs are going to be the Microsoft Log Parser that we can download from Microsoft. We'll see how to do that. And Visual Log Parser, which requires Log Parser, but is actually a third-party tool, free. If we look at SQL Server Management Studio and expand the tabs, we'll see that there are SQL Server logs. And these logs start every once in a while and push other logs down the list. You're going to have the current log plus 6. The logs reinitialize and renumber themselves when you restart SQL Server. If you don't restart SQL Server very often, looking at these logs and filtering through them using the tools can take an unreasonably long amount of time. So some people go ahead and create a job that runs a stored procedure that automatically restarts the log without restarting SQL Server. This is a good idea, but you need to be aware that if you recycle this too quickly, some of the information that you want, because it's recent enough, may actually cycle out the bottom of this list and no longer be available. That we can discuss at another time. If we right-click on one of these logs, we can open the SQL Server Log Viewer. And notice that it shows the archives here as well as the current log. You can go ahead and click on as many of those as you want. And as a matter of fact, you'll also see SQL Server Agent, Database Mail, and as mentioned before, this Windows NT node is actually going to connect to the Windows NT event service and let us see some things that come from Windows, not from SQL Server, although it may contain some of the same information. If we look at the lower left-hand corner of the screen, we can see that we can make a filter, which is a very useful ability to have. If we click on that, we come up with this dialog. For our purposes here, knowing what I know, I'm going to just go ahead and say the message contains text failed. I'm going to click on Apply Filter. Sometimes I forget to do that and wonder why it's not filtering. And that's because they have this extra checkbox. When I do that, we see a whole bunch of things. I've scrolled down a little bit. One thing I would notice is that there are a whole bunch of errors here, and that over to the right they say client. That's an IP address. It's showing that all of these failed attempts are coming from the same IP address. Now that's very suspicious. Having a failure for a user is not necessarily suspicious, because as SA, I might not even type it in correctly myself, remember what it is for that particular SQL server. But these are all coming from the same place, and I can look at that and tell you that most of these login names for SQL Server do not exist on any SQL server that I manage. We're going to see later on how to tell what country the IP address is in. That pretty much nails it, that we're getting some bad, malicious attempts to access this server. So this is the way to find some of these, at least initially, that we're looking at. When you see this and go through your own machine, what's on my machine is not as helpful as what you see on your own machine. When you look at this, hopefully you're a little bit frightened because you see something that shows they have guessed something close to names you use, or that suggests that you have created a temporary user with a simple name and have forgotten to remove that user. That's part of the education that you need to get out of this experience. Now, we're going to come back to the SQL Server Log Viewer, but I'd like to go first to the Windows Event Viewer, which you can get at in several ways. A typical way being just typing it in from your main screen, letting it find it. But you can also go to Control Panel, and Control Panel to me is somewhat annoying and having multiple layers of clicking I have to do when what I know is the name of what I want and I don't need this kind of help. So you can go and you can change the category view to large icons or small icons and just go directly to what you want. You can go to Administrative Tools. This is a large icon view. And when we do that, we get back to the same screen we saw before, which shows the administrative tools on this Windows server. Actually, this is a Windows workstation. This is Windows 10. We can tell because it says computer management rather than server management, but the issues are all going to be exactly the same. One of the places to look first is in your SQL Server logs. Here is an image of SQL Server Management Studio. Notice that it has a management node that exists at the instance level for SQL Server, and that it shows a number of logs that your server has been creating. If we right-click on one of those log names, we can view it through the SQL Server Log Viewer, and notice that not only it shows the SQL Server logs, but it will also show logs pertaining to some other items, but we're not going to look at those at the moment. Notice at the lower left-hand corner, you can filter what you see in the log to find things that are of more interest to your immediate investigation. By clicking on multiple checkboxes at the top, you can actually see the data for more logs. You can see the logs information interleaved with other logs without switching back and forth according to the time that they occurred, and this can be useful also. Now, if we do click on the filter settings, we get a screen that has a number of things, and for our purposes right now, I'm going to type in failed, and we also have to click the apply filter checkbox. If you don't, it's not going to filter it. Might be a little frustrating if you don't recognize that checkbox. When we look at it, we're going to see a number of things with messages, and we're going to see that the logins failed for a large number of users. Now, some of them were in fact, perhaps, although not on this screen, me trying to log in using the wrong password. The topmost entry here, we see someone tried to log in as SA because they know that account exists, but that IP address is not mine, and we're going to investigate seeing where that IP address came from in a later slide. With my server, but that have been shown by the person trying to hack in to be things that are likely to exist on my server. Notice there's a user A, for example. How many times have I created a user account, test 1, without thinking about security and then forgotten to delete the account? We should consider being more careful with temporary accounts as well. So this is a place to go and find useful information that should inform us some. Another place to go is to the Windows Event Viewer. And you can get at it by going to your main screen, typing in a few characters and finding it. You can also go to your control panel. And because I don't like navigating through a whole bunch of these layers of organization that are not helpful to me, I generally go to the large icon or small icon view of control panel. Find administrative tools, click on Event Viewer, and then get to Event Viewer. Notice that it says Event Viewer Local. That means that by default it connects to the Event Viewer of the computer that you are running on. There are Windows logs, application logs, and notice this screen has 3 parts. The tree view on the left, a central data region, and on the right, an actions panel. The actions panel was added somewhere in the history of Windows, and I'm still trying to get used to looking for things that I can do there. Very often it duplicates what I can do by right-clicking on something in the tree view, but occasionally there are things that I actually have to go to this actions panel to implement. If we expand the Windows logs, we'll see there is a number of categories. One of them is application. The thing to understand about Windows tools is that everything that is not a part of Windows is either a user process or an application. So under the security subsection here of the Windows logs, we are not going to find failed SQL Server logins. That's going to be under the application node, which is going to contain many things, much of which duplicates we see in the SQL Server logs. As we examine the security node, we will see things that are specific to that log. Every log can have different sets of columns. We see there's keywords, a source, and task categories under that source. When we go to the bottom, we are going to see an expanded view, additional information for the thing that is highlighted. This region that is scrollable is where a lot of the good information is. And the thing we notice at the top is the subject security ID. While sometimes that's useful information, we're going to see that the login names that we really want to get at, we have to scroll down to. We'll see that in a moment. But notice that at the bottom, information is duplicated that we see at the top. And of some interest might be the fact that this level of information is information. It's not critical. The world doesn't end when there's an invalid login attempt, because it happens innocently enough as well. So this is at the information level. This login that was attempted in Windows was successful. On the far right side of the screen, we're going to see the ability to filter the current log, which is going to make the log much more useful. We have the ability to create views of the log, which are essentially the same kind of filter, but it preserves our definition for the filter. I'm not going to go into that right now. So we click on Filter Current Log. When this screen comes up, we find the ability to filter on many things. The thing that is confusing about this screen to me is that when we select something in one combo box, it does not automatically filter items in the other combo boxes. So we can go through this and be precise, as I'm going to show you at first, but it really isn't necessary. In this case, I'm going to go down and select Microsoft Windows Security Auditing, We could select more than one thing if we wanted more than one thing in our view after we filtered the data. So here we see that we selected Microsoft Windows Security. The event log is selected for us because I clicked on the Filter Current Log option under Actions while the security node was visible. We have the Microsoft Windows Security Auditing, which I just selected. Selecting that under Event Sources does nothing to filter the task category and keywords to things that are relevant to what I have already selected. So it turns out I could have done all of this without checking information, without checking the event source or task category, and just gone down to Audit Failure. That would be sufficient. Once we do that, we see only events that are audit failures. Once again, we go to the bottom of the screen and we see this top security section, which does not give us the information I'm looking for here. We have to scroll down. And when we do, we'll see someone attempted to log in to Windows, not SQL Server, with the SQL Windows account name. It says unknown username and bad passwords. I can tell you this is an unknown username on this system. If we go down a bit further, we can see the network address that it came from. If it's within your organization, that might be interesting. But how do we determine where it is if it isn't? Well, there are a number of websites where you can go and put in an IP address, scroll down, and it will say this came from China. And I find many other invalid IP addresses that have been attempting to attach to my server. I could go ahead, if relevant and possible, and set up a system that filters out IP addresses from, say, other countries, where I know that the only people who have legitimate use of this particular Windows server or SQL server are within my country. This is really a job for Windows administrators, but then again, you may be the IT guy that just does it all. So we may have another video on eliminating IP addresses from foreign or hostile countries. This can be something like whack-a-mole because people who do that use IP addresses in countries like I use toilet paper, and you cut one off and they try from somewhere else. But I think sometimes it is probably worth the effort to do your best. I'm sure there are third-party tools and programs that will assist you in this. The thing that makes it difficult is that IP addresses for a country are not contiguous. They are assigned in blocks, essentially at random, and then the router system and programming has to figure out what goes where. Once we have looked at the Windows event log and the SQL Server logs, we should be aware that while they're not the easiest things to work with for filtering some kinds of data, that there are some tools that assist in that, and one of them is Log Parser, which you can download from Microsoft. It permits the execution of SQL-like queries against the actual data running and being collected on your machine, and it also permits analyzing this data through SQL-like scripts from files that you have saved in a wide variety of formats. It is a command line application. If you want to have something that has a nicer user interface, then you go to Visual Log Parser that comes from Codeplex. It relies upon you having Log Parser, the command line version, already installed, so you need both of them. This is not a substitute for it. Once you download and install Log Parser and Visual Log Parser, you're going to get this nice little program. This combo box is going to reflect the kind of data you're getting and not the format of the source, because the from clause will permit you to access operating system files, for example, even multiple operating system files. But it's going to be looking for event viewer type data in it. The from clause is going to determine where that data is actually stored. This is a screenshot of Log Parser Help. It's going to show the basic query statements, keywords that can be used. Should be very familiar to SQL Server people. It's also going to show the functions which start at the bottom, which are not necessarily standard functions, but might be helpful in analyzing logs. Here we see a list of some of the input formats and output formats. Again, those formats don't tell us whether it's from the live data being captured or from, for example, a comma-separated value file. That's determined by the from clause. But what it finds in the from clause is going to be determined by the input format. The output formats are going to have more to do with how it saves the data to disk. For instance, I can save event viewer data as a comma-separated value file after I have filtered it. Let's look at this. It says select star from application. Now, when I first look at a log, I generally say select top 10 from something just to see what columns are there, how it's presented. Notice here I said select star from application, not security, which is what we're going to look at in a minute, because I wanted to emphasize the fact that SQL Server login failures are not in the security log of the Windows Event Viewer. It's in the application event log because SQL Server is an application, not part of the operating system. Here we can go ahead and examine things where it says there were login failures and see what sort of format they have, what sort of data is contained in it. Then we can go around and expand the columns that contain more useful information. Here it shows something similar, if not identical, to what we saw in the SQL Server log. Many things get written both places, and it shows the IP address. Remember that you're going to be finding things that actually are legitimate errors by authorized users. We see here that there's an SA attempt from an IP address that is not appropriate. If we go ahead and look at the security log, we see that there are different columns. These different types of logs, even from Event Viewer, don't contain the same columns, I don't believe. But we can examine the type of data that is in it so that we can then form a better query. And in this case, I'm going to put where message like login failed, and the message doesn't contain admin because it gives too many results. Now, in fact, the hackers are going to use admin and administrator and test and user one and Bill and Mary and that sort of thing. We're going to talk more about the administrator account, SA, special accounts in a different video. In this case, we want to look at the account names people are using and see if from these bad IP addresses people are using things that present a security hazard to our system. Here we can expand columns from that same query and go and look and see what those names are, see more of the names. I've scrolled down a little bit. You can write to the Windows event log from T-SQL code through the stored procedure XP log event. Its syntax is shown here. I work better with examples than syntax, and you should be able to find those easily on the web. The stored procedure writes the information from the extended stored procedure to the Windows event service, and therefore the Windows event application log, and to the SQL Server log, both of them. You can use this extended stored procedure from the query window in Management Studio with any stored procedure or in scripts run with SQL command. Windows administrators may be able to see SQL Server logs without doing anything. By default, the built-in administrator account is in the sysadmin role. But many times we remove these rights because we don't want Windows administrators mucking around in our SQL Server. Windows administrators can always see SQL Server messages written to the Windows event logs. SQL Server administrators who are not Windows administrators cannot automatically see relevant log information through the Windows Event Viewer. If you're not a Windows administrator and a SQL Server administrator, there are likely to be things in logs that you cannot see that require special security to permit. If you're a SQL Server administrator and you cannot see the log information you need, this is suggestive of poor management. I have been in places where they say Windows administrators see Windows logs, SQL Server administrators see SQL Server logs, And that is a stupid position to have. Developers should be able to have access to these logs on the appropriate development machines. They contain a wealth of information, and bureaucratic pig-headedness is a situation I would not continue to tolerate were I in that situation.